A premier from Canada sat down expecting nothing more than a regular television interview. Yet in roughly 90 seconds he delivered a comment so striking that the newsroom fell into a noticeable hush afterward. He never raised his voice or issued any kind of threat. He simply leaned forward and suggested that perhaps, just perhaps, the Americans should make the Epstein Files public. Only then would Manitoba consider restocking the shelves with liquor. This is Wab Kinew, Premier of Manitoba, a province of roughly 1.5 million people. And with that single sentence he transformed a trade disagreement over whiskey and wine into a story that crossed into every major American newsroom by Saturday morning. But what most reporting has overlooked is that this was never an impulsive aside from an irritated local politician. The hard numbers behind the moment reveal a far more calculated situation. American alcohol exports to Canada have plunged by more than 70%. More than 70% in the space of 1 year alone. Distilleries across the United States are now forced to scale back or pause operations. Jim Beam closed its primary Kentucky plant for an entire year. Brown-Forman, the company behind Jack Daniel's, saw its Canadian sales drop more than 60% during the first half of their fiscal year. The biggest names in American spirits are quietly suffering losses that trace almost entirely back to those empty Canadian shelves. Over the next few minutes I want to walk you through exactly what Kinew said, why he chose that precise moment to say it, and how a quiet strategic shift under Prime Minister Mark Carney has quietly rewritten the math of this trade war in a manner Washington is only now beginning to comprehend. The interview itself became the headline everyone noticed. The deeper strategy driving it is the story that truly matters. Here's what actually unfolded. On the evening of April 24th, Kinew joined CTV News in Winnipeg. The reporter pressed him on recent public remarks from the United States Trade Representative and the United States Commerce Secretary. Both officials had complained openly that several Canadian provinces continued to refuse American liquor on government-controlled shelves. One described it as a serious problem. The other called it insulting and disrespectful. The narrative push from Washington was unmistakable. Canada was acting childish. Canada was being unreasonable. Canada simply needed to stop. That was the official line. The operational reality on the ground tells a completely different tale. The provincial alcohol bans never began as some kind of emotional outburst. They started in February of 2025 after President Trump placed a 25% tariff on roughly $30 billion of Canadian goods, citing a national security emergency. Within days 8 of Canada's 10 provinces, 8 out of 10, directed their liquor authorities to remove American beer, wine, and spirits from store shelves. This was not a federal directive. It was a provincial move and it enjoyed broad popularity. Polling from Nano's research in 2026 shows that more than 8 out of 10 Canadians now see boycotting American goods as the right response. 8 in 10. That is not a fringe position. It is a national consensus. Then in February of 2026, the United States Supreme Court ruled the original tariffs unconstitutional and overturned them. But the Trump administration immediately turned to alternative tariff authorities to maintain similar pressure. The pressure never let up. Neither did the boycott. By the time Kinew sat down with CTV last month, the trade representative was issuing public threats against Canada. He told reporters that existing tariffs on Canadian industrial goods would remain in place and could even increase until Canada reversed the alcohol restrictions. That is the full context. Kinew's answer was straightforward. If the United States wants the booze back on the shelves, the United States must first remove the tariffs. Then he added the remark that instantly became the headline. He observed that Trump clearly dislikes the Epstein Files. He noted that Trump tends to do something, quote, pretty wild whenever those files surface. And with what appeared to be a small smile, he suggested that maybe Canada should add the release of the Epstein Files to the list of demands. Now pause and consider what that actually signifies. A premier leading only one Canadian province used a daytime news interview to publicly connect a trade dispute about wine and whiskey to one of the most politically charged files in the United States. He made no accusations. He named no individuals. He simply highlighted a vulnerable spot and let the cameras follow where the attention went next. It is worth stepping back to remember who Wab Kinew actually is, because the messenger carries real weight here. Kinew leads Manitoba, a Central Prairie province whose capital is Winnipeg, and whose population sits just over 1.5 million. He is also the first First Nations premier of a Canadian province in modern history, a former broadcaster and university administrator widely regarded in Canadian politics as someone who chooses his words with care. He is not a firebrand. He is not a populist. He is the sort of leader who would normally offer the most diplomatic phrasing possible in any trade disagreement. The fact that this is the politician who chose to mention the Epstein Files on television reveals how much the political center of gravity inside Canada has moved. By Saturday morning, the clip had reached every major American network and most political accounts on social media. The Epstein Files Transparency Act had already become United States law. The Justice Department had already released millions of pages. A watchdog review was already underway inside the department, examining how those releases had been handled. In other words, the Epstein Files were already a live, messy, unresolved political issue in Washington when Kinew named them on Canadian television. He did not invent the controversy. He simply pulled it into the trade conversation in a way no foreign leader had ever done before. That moment may surprise many viewers. Foreign politicians normally avoid domestic political scandals in another country. The unwritten rule has always been to stay out of the other side's internal affairs. You complain about tariffs. You file complaints at the World Trade Organization. You do not raise sealed court documents during a television interview about beer. Kinew broke that rule, and he broke it deliberately. Now hold that thought against the broader moves Canada has made on the trade front, because timing is everything. While Kinew generated headlines in Winnipeg, Prime Minister Mark Carney was already several moves ahead on a separate chessboard. Since taking office, Carney has completed 26 foreign trips, 26 in a single year. That pace alone speaks volumes. No Canadian Prime Minister in living memory has traveled at that rate during their first 12 months. And the majority of those trips were not mere photo opportunities. They were serious trade missions, defense discussions, and quiet groundwork for the strategy now unfolding in public view. Consider the sheer scale of what has been signed or revived in just over a year. Canada finalized a trade agreement with Indonesia. Canada finalized an agreement with Ecuador. Canada signed an investment deal with the United Arab Emirates. Canada restarted formal trade talks with India after a long diplomatic freeze under the previous government. Canada and Japan announced a comprehensive strategic partnership in March of 2026, signed in Tokyo, that covers defense, cybersecurity, supply chains, energy, food security, climate cooperation, and Arctic protection. That partnership specifically includes plans to ship more Alberta liquefied natural gas to Tokyo, gas that until recently was assumed to flow only south into the American market. Canada signed a defense and security partnership with South Korea, with a Canadian trade mission scheduled to follow. Canada is actively negotiating free trade deals with Thailand, the Philippines, and the broader ASEAN bloc, a 10-country group representing more than 600 million people. Carney has stated publicly that he wants those deals completed within a year, and Canada has even reached a trade understanding with China, an idea that would have been politically unthinkable in Ottawa just 2 years earlier. Carney met directly with Chinese President Xi Jinping at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum in South Korea in late 2025. Both sides described the meeting as a turning point, a careful diplomatic phrase governments use when they want to signal that an old framework is ending and a new one is beginning. And then there is Europe, the element that may matter most. In June of 2025, Canada and the European Union announced the new EU-Canada Strategic Partnership of the Future, along with a security and defense partnership. Then in February of 2026, Canada became the first non-European country ever to join the European Union SAFE initiative, SAFE, Europe's flagship defense readiness program. The first non-European country ever. Read that again. Canada is no longer merely a NATO ally on paper. Canada is now legally embedded inside Europe's defense industrial base, with billions of dollars in market access for Canadian defense companies, engineers, and shipyards. The European Union has become Canada's second-largest trading partner for goods and services, with a total flow of about $178 billion in 2025. $178 billion, more than the entire annual budget of most Canadian provinces. In early May of 2026, just days before Kinew's interview aired, Carney attended yet another European summit on trade and security partnerships, building directly on those same SAFE and EU agreements. He sat at tables where the American president would traditionally have been the dominant voice. The American president was not there. This is not a country searching for an exit from a trade war. This is a country that has already built its exit and is now waiting to see how long the United States wants to keep pushing. Remember when Canada was viewed in Washington as the polite neighbor, the country that would always come back to the table, always sign, always agree? That country no longer exists in the way American officials still imagine it. The ground rules have changed. The Berlin Wall came down in 1989. The world order that followed, where the United States set the rules and allies adjusted, is the one older viewers remember most clearly. What you are seeing now is a piece of that order being quietly rewritten, one trade deal at a time, by a country most Americans still picture as a junior partner. And here is a fact easy to miss amid the headlines. Canada's pivot is not yet complete. About 75% of Canada's merchandise exports still go to the United States. About 88% of Canadian energy exports still go to the United States. Critics inside Canada argue Carney is moving too fast toward Europe and not fast enough toward Asia, where real growth lies. Others argue the opposite. The point remains that even with the new deals, the Canadian economy is still structurally tied to the American one in deep ways. Carney knows it, Kinew knows it, the trade representative knows it. But what has changed is the political calculation. The American leverage used to rest on the idea that Canada could not survive without the United States. The old Canadian response used to be, "We know, please be reasonable." The Canadian response now is, "We are still here, we are still trading, but we are no longer dependent in the way we once were." Every new trade deal represents a small reduction in that dependency. Every new defense partnership represents a small reduction in